Welcome everyone. We're so happy to have you join us this afternoon. This is the event seminar, Demystifying the Biomedical Regulatory Landscape. My name is Melissa Mudd. I'm an Alliance Manager for Oregon Health and Science University's Clinical and Translational Research Institute, or Oaktree. At Oaktree, our mission is to advance translational science to clinical practice. So the event seminar series offered by Oaktree is with the goal of introducing concepts and pathways to commercialization, to offer networking and skill building opportunities for innovation and entrepreneurship to OHSU and our larger biomedical community across the region. Today, we have a fantastic person joining us to talk all about the regulatory basics for new healthcare technologies. I'm pleased to introduce Brie Stoianoff. Brie is currently the Regional Director for Healthcare Alliances at Philips and has over 20 years of experience providing regulatory expertise to entrepreneurs and early stage companies. She's worked with a variety of device diagnostics and therapeutic products. And before we get started, she'll kind of go over details of herself a little bit broader than that. But before we get started, we have a few poll questions that we wanted to ask everyone, just to orient Brie to who's in the audience. So as I launch this, please go ahead and take a minute or two just to answer these 3 quick questions. Hopefully everyone can see it. There we go. All right. I'm going to give you one last second and then I'll close the poll. Okay. So sharing the results. Like we have a fairly device heavy, but definitely some interest in other areas. If you answered other, would you mind putting in the chat what the specific area that you're interested in learning about today, if it's different from those ones? And it looks like we have a pretty new audience, new to regulatory information, so that's great. And a good vary of diversity in the roles.
Great.
Great, thanks everyone for taking the minute to do that. So before I let Brie take the stage, I just want to let you know that you're all welcome to send questions in the chat. I'll moderate to Brie throughout the presentation. And then at the end, there's going to be plenty of time for Q&A. So I hope you all brought some questions. And then when we get to that portion, just feel free to turn on your video and your microphone and we'll have a little bit more of a discussion. Okay, Brie, take it away.
Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everyone. As Melissa said, I'm Brie Stoianoff. So although I'm currently a regional director for healthcare alliances with Philips, I've spent over 20 years in the industry, in the FDA regulated industry. I spent the first 7 years or so in the pharmaceutical world. And then I spent the past 14 or 15 years in the medical device space since moving out to Oregon. I actually also have a master's degree in quality and regulatory from a pharmacy school. So it's focused on FDA regulated industry, but all about the quality and regulatory space. So that's where I'm coming from. I've only been in this current role for about 6 months now. Prior to that, I led efforts dealing with compliance issues and overall quality and global transformation efforts for Philips. And prior to that, I worked for consulting firms and owned my own consulting firms in the region. And really, I'm passionate about helping individuals in this region and throughout Oregon become more familiar with what it takes to get a product to the market and then help them make connections to help them get their products onto the market. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of people who know that area because we don't have a lot of the industry out here. When I did my master's degree in Philadelphia and worked out there, people like me are kind of a dime a dozen, and out here we're very few and far between. So I want to do what I can to help out this region and help us become more of an innovative space in the bioscience industry. So that's where I'm coming from today. And the goal today is a pretty high level, I'm going to be honest, but I'm hoping for lots of interaction, questions, so that we can dig into the things that are on your mind. So we'll talk through that a bit about how FDA is organized, how we get drugs, biologics, and medical devices onto the market. We'll touch a bit on some others. I'm going to be open and say that my most recent expertise is really in the device space, but I do know quite a bit about the pharma and biologics. And if I can't answer the question, I know lots of people who can, and I'll be sure to get back to you on that.
Brie, just checking and make sure you're sharing your slides.
I will be in just a moment. Thanks, though. Make sure I'm doing the right thing. There we go. Okay. All right. So here we go. So a little bit, we're talking about how FDA is organized, because I think that's important as you ever know the structure of any large regulated body that you're dealing with, the types of products that it covers, a quick overview about those regulations, how products are classified. This definitely comes into effect, mostly in the device space, but definitely in the pharma space. I think you'll be a bit surprised at that. And then what is required to get your product onto the market? And then you're not out of the woods then. At that point, you still have a lot to do anytime your product is on the market. And even if you pull it off, you still have some obligations at that point. So the FDA is structured as follows. So there's the Commissioner of the Food and Drugs, and that's currently an acting position. It's Janet Woodcock. And within it, in the areas that affect most of us, talk about biologics, devices and in vitro diagnostics, drugs, enforcement, and animal health. So what that means is we've got the Center for Biologics, which is CBER, Center for Devices and Radiological Health, CDRH, drugs, the CDER, the regulatory affairs. Those are the folks that come and investigate, go visit sites. They're the ones that people tend to be scared of a little bit, I have to say. And then Center for Veterinary Medicine. There's quite a few companies these days that are starting in the veterinary space and then moving into humans. So I wanted to make sure to include that in there. FDA has many other different organizations that all report up into the commissioner's area. Some of them are actually pretty new. So the minority health and health equity is fairly recent, within the past 5 years or so. And oncology, they only added in the past, I think, 6 or 7 years. So pretty recent. So this is all of what makes up the FDA. Here in the Portland metro area, we have 2 inspectors' offices, but there is all the reviewing for any new drugs or new devices actually occurs out in Maryland at their main campus. So a little bit of background. So in 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act created the Bureau of Chemistry within USDA. Prior to that, drugs, food, devices were not regulated in any way prior to that. It was a lot of it because of the meat packing plants, those quote patent medicines that you hear about when cocaine was used to solve everything, was in place. And because of primarily there was a book, The Jungle, about the meatpacking industry in the upper Midwest, mostly Chicago, that came out, and people realized just how tainted their food was. So they created this bureau in 1906. And it was mostly focused on food and some drugs. But then in 1938, it really was bulked up with the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And that still exists today. We still reference it today. I still go back to the text of that law to talk about it. And that's when what we call now the Food and Drug Administration was created. And really, the reason that was created is because of a scandal that was called the tincture of sulfanilamide. What that was is it was a common pain relief calming drug that was used throughout the industry, throughout the country. And some pharmacist in the South decided that, hey, we need to make this available for children. And so he did. And what the liquid that he put it into suspension was actually poisonous, and it killed dozens of children throughout the South. And at that point, the federal government and Congress, because of an outroar, came out and said, look, we need to have more regulations in place so that we're not, erroneously killing our children. Wasn't until at that point, medical devices were not regulated at all. It wasn't until 1976, the medical device amendments came out, pretty loose, didn't really say much. And then 20 years later, so just 25 years ago, the quality system regulation, and that is all of the regulations that are involved with how medical devices are regulated, was put into effect. So what we have, nothing's really been updated. I mean, there's been minor stuff, but for the medical device space since 1996, for the pharmaceutical space, frankly, since the early 80s, not much has really been updated since then. So what does FDA regulate? It regulates products, and it does that by regulating companies responsible for the manufacturer. It does not regulate component manufacturers or the practice of medicine. So it doesn't regulate hospitals, it doesn't regulate doctors. However, if a physician or a hospital is developing a drug or a medical device, or is maybe performing a clinical trial on one of those things, it has regulatory authority over that, but not around the practice of medicine. Talk a little bit about component manufacturers. This has been in the news a lot lately, well, in the past 10 years or so. Although FDA does not actually regulate component manufacturers, they don't register with the FDA for the most part. They do hold the individuals that are the companies that are selling the products that has those components responsible. So if you are making a drug and you have a bottle that you use and you buy that bottle from some plastics manufacturer, and that plastics, there's some issue with the plastic and that it leaches some poison into the drug, it's going to hold the drug company liable for that they should have done more to control the components, the suppliers that they have. So here's some examples of products that the FDA regulates. So it's everything from drugs, I love this sort of a cocktail of who knows what, medical devices, this is a stent, a cardiac stent, transport wheelchairs, all kind of wheelchairs. Blood and blood products is regulated by the Center for Biologics. Nutraceuticals or supplements, you may hear it, is regulated, but only their manufacturer is regulated, not the contents of it. Cosmetics, tobacco is regulated. That's been in the news a lot lately, even just in the past few months with around the smokeless tobacco, the Juul type cigarette situation, and then processed foods. FDA does not regulate fresh foods, but it does regulate processed foods. All right, so where does this authority come from? So there's, in anything that goes into effect, there is a law, which was the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that we talked about. And from that law, the agency interpreted it into regulations so that they can actually be used by those that are impacted by it. So industry in this point. So one example is the quality system regulation. So that's for the medical device space. We're going to talk about that a bit more. But then, as we talked about, the quality system regulation was not put into effect, was put into effect 25 years ago. Obviously, there's been some changes since then. So how do they primarily talk about things that are changing? They're called guidance documents. All three of these things are things that if you work in this space, you need to be aware of. You need to be aware of changes to them because they all directly impact how we design, develop, and distribute products into this space. So a recent example, obviously very recent, this was just updated in September, the enforcement policy for face masks, barrier face coverings, face shields, surgical masks, and respirators during the COVID-19 emergency. So if you all remember back in, second quarter of 2020, it was pretty impossible to find a mask to buy. It's when everybody was scrounging through their own fabric and asking their neighbors to make them various masks. At that point, there's very strict controls about what masks are because we want to make sure that they're effective. And so this was clarification about, they sort of expanded or loosened the restrictions around making these products available to the US market. So they try to be as reactive as they can. Obviously, it goes through a big process, but these are the types of things. And this can include everything from like what we're talking about here to interpretations about the regulations about how you organize your company. It can also have very specific things, maybe like the certain types of tests you should do to test a medical device that you're developing. So these are the things that go on. They're changing regularly and they're all publicly available on the FDA's website. So the other thing I want to talk about a bit is definitions. So a drug, it's a purified chemical entity used to diagnose, treat, or prevent disease, or intended to affect the structure or function of the body. You may hear these a lot as small molecules. So that's the ibuprofen, the lithium carbonate, the statins, anything you probably think of as drug pretty traditionally. A medical device, the big thing that it differs is that it's something that is not metabolized by the body. So if in no way it is metabolized by the body, it then becomes a medical device. Sometimes you will see some medical devices that are actually swallowed or applied topically to the skin, and depends upon whether or not they have drug product that is metabolized. So the typical things we think of, everything from your Band-Aid to your toothbrush to contact lenses and your ultrasound machines, your ECMO, everything in between. Biologic is kind of the large molecule. So these are very complex mixtures that are not easily identifiable, not easily identified or characterized. And they are always isolated from a natural source. So these can be blood components, these can be sourced from proteins, tissues. They include vaccines, gene therapy, all of those things. You'll hear them as large molecule. So that's the difference between drugs and biologics. It's typically the size of whatever it is that you're working with. In vitro diagnostics, it's a reagent. It's something that you use to determine the state of health diagnosis, everything from like a urine pregnancy test to the COVID-19 assays. It also includes the equipment that's involved with that. The other thing that's present is a combination product. As we evolved as a society, we no longer have sort of clearly drug or clearly devices. There's some things that cross between two areas, and we call those combination products. They're a little bit messy. When we talked about the organizational structure of the FDA, it's not super clear as to who regulates what. So they work together and sort of create their own regulatory structure. So like a drug-coated stent, cardiac stent, so that's going to have a drug on top of a medical device, a stent. A pre-filled syringe, it's going to have that device, the syringe, and then whatever the drug or biologic that is inside of it. So those are all considered combination products and are in a sort of a world of their own. So every product, and I think maybe the argument could be made that any product, whether it's regulated by the FDA or not, is going to go through all of these phases. So we go through research, we have an idea, we start with research and development, we do some sort of prototyping, be that a physical object, be that a drug, whatever it might be. We've got to scale that up, manufacturing for our customers, and then distribution. So let's talk a bit about what that looks like specifically to the drug biologic space and the medical device space. All right, so we talk here about drugs and biologics. They follow very similar paths. Yes, there are definitely differences. There's a whole lot of different sets of, technical issues, but from a regulatory perspective, they're pretty similar. So that's why I grouped them together for purposes of today. So the regulations that get involved, we talk about classification. So initially it's classification. Is this a prescription product or is this an over-the-counter product? Is this a new molecular entity or is this some sort of a generic or a biosimilar? Once your classification is done, obviously in the background, there's a lot of research work that's going on. At whatever point that you decide to go into animals or into humans, the good laboratory practices and the good clinical practices requirements go into effect. That makes sure that we're looking out for human and animal health throughout the process, that the data that is being created is reliable and worthy, and that we're taking care of, we're just being very conscious about the work that we're doing. Once you're starting to consider going into humans, that's when some level of good manufacturing practices goes into effect. These are the regulations that the FDA has put forth to make sure that any drug product that you make is consistent, reliable, and is what you stated is on the label. That continues for the life of the product, and frankly, even after the product has been pulled off the market. All of these things are done in preparation for your final submission to the agency. So in this situation, it's a new drug application, most typically, an abbreviated new drug application. We'll talk about these a bit more that are for generics, or a biologics license applications for the biologics. At that point, once FDA says yes, they approve it. That's something they do in the drug world, is they approve it. They don't typically do that in devices. We'll talk a bit more. You then have an obligation to register that product and list it with the FDA. That says, here is the product I'm making, here are the strengths that it's in, all of that's publicly available information. At that point, you then have obligations about how the product is to be, making sure that the product that is on the market is performing as you expect it to, and to monitor that process. So the devices, things are a little bit different. So you have the classifications we'll talk into. There's 3 groups of classifications. The quality system requirements. So if you're familiar with GMPs, so the GMPs for medical devices start very early and they cover the entire life cycle. So the instant that you start designing that product is when those regulations go into effect. And the rationale for that is they want to make sure that you're thinking through all of the potential issues that could come up with a medical device, so that you're accounting for it and for its potential risks and benefits throughout the life cycle of the product. Through that, you're developing a whole lot of documentation around the design, how you've tested it, why it does what it does do or does not do in preparation for a submission to the FDA. So it's typically a much shorter timeline. We think back to the drug space, that can be anywhere from the 5 to 20 years of time. In the device space, you could get a new product to market in 6 months, or at least you could go to the submission phase to FDA in 3 to 6 months. That's not uncommon. Once you start manufacturing that product for use for testing, in use for distribution to your consumers, there are more regulations around production and process controls that make sure that you're making that same product consistently go into effect. And then also, once that product's on the market, you're obligated to register and list it with the FDA, just like you are with drugs. Of course, all of this costs money, but then also monitor how that product is performing once it's been distributed to the marketplace. So we talk a bit about classification, because that's kind of the first thing that you do. In the drugs and biologic space, it's really classified based upon the availability of the drug and the composition of the drug. So whether it's a prescription drug or it's over the counter, that's sort of defines what sort of testing and development work needs to go on. And again, composition. So is it a brand new molecular entity, or is it some sort of generic, kind of a me too? The biologics world, their quote generic, I hate to use that word, is actually called a biosimilar. And the one thing that's different, and this is something I just learned about a year ago, I honestly didn't know this, is that if you go to a pharmacy and you have a prescription for a drug, the pharmacist can substitute the generic drug without any consultation. Obviously, they'll probably talk to you as the patient and say, I can offer this, it's a lot cheaper, I'm going to give it to you. A biosimilar, however, the pharmacist cannot offer the biosimilar, or what many people refer to as the generic biologic, to the patient without first approval from whomever wrote the prescription. It's really because the manufacturing processes are so complex in the biologic space that you can never have an identical drug product or biologic product that's going out. So a little piece of information there. So in the device space, device and in vitro diagnostics, we have 3 classes. The higher the class number, so class 3 is the highest risk products. Class 1 is the lowest risk products. So it's really based upon the intended use and the risk of harm both to the patient and to the user. So the user could be the surgeon using a scalpel in an environment, or the nurse working with a bedside vital signs monitor. So it is important that those users are taken into account, just the same that the patient, whomever is receiving, sort of the end point of that medical device is taken into account. So 47% of all medical devices fall into class 1. It's like your bandages, your toothbrushes, your stethoscope, a transport wheelchair. Very simple. They're usually not very complex. They typically don't have software that's involved with them. They typically aren't powered. There are some exceptions, but they're very low risk. They don't typically have to do much other than register with the FDA, claim that they're in compliance, and then off we go. The FDA doesn't invest a whole lot of its resources into class 1 because they're such low risk to the environment. So a tongue depressor or a Band-Aid is unlikely to really hurt a patient, whereas some more higher risk product might do that. Another 43% is what we call class 2. So this is usually everything that's available with everything that's available with a prescription that's on the marketplace or that is used by a professional, usually some sort of healthcare provider. It's powered wheelchairs, it's bone screws, it's most joints, total joints, it's your blood glucose monitor. We'll talk a bit more about what goes into getting those products on the market. They're not approved by FDA, they're what they call cleared. We'll talk a bit more about that. Then about 10% are class 3. Those are the super high risk. It's a much longer process. You have to provide a whole lot more evidence to the FDA to get those products on the market, and they're a lot riskier. So it's an implantable pacemaker, it's breast implants, it's a heart valve. It's things that if they don't work right, they could very quickly cause serious harm or even death to the end user or the patient in these situations. So the FDA invests a lot more time and resources into these products. So I imagine that a question that might be coming out from you is, all right, I'm working on developing this new medical device. How do I figure out which this falls into? What do I need to know? FDA has some really great information. Oops, apparently I have to share this here. Within the FDA, oops, my apologies. That didn't work like I wanted it to. Okay. So FDA, any product that's on the market, how it's regulated, and the other products that fall into that category are all publicly available. So if I know that there's a product, so let's just say a wheelchair, something I'm assuming everybody's all familiar with. We go, this is on the FDA's website, as you can see. We look up wheelchair and look, there's a whole bunch of different types. Usually very simple. I mean, there's 30 types. So, and what these then show you, let's look at a powered wheelchair. So this might be something a consumer would use. This will tell you exactly how it's regulated, the types of tests, the standards to which, so this has got a whole lot of them. If you want to develop a new powered wheelchair and put it onto the market, you need to confirm compliance with all of these various standards and tests that are internationally recognized. So they say, if you want to do it, that's great. Here's everything that you need to do. They're sort of giving you a recipe with how to get onto the market. Even within the regulations, it says specifically, what is a powered wheelchair? It's a battery operated device with wheels that is intended for medical purposes to provide mobility to persons restricted to a sitting position. So you can see that it's there, and it's also a class 2. So very specifically, it states right here that it is a class 2. When we looked back at the list of, there we go, all the different types of wheelchairs, they're class 1 and they're class 2. Some of these things have changed. So a wheelchair that can go up a stairs, for example, you've probably seen those. They have some sort of gyroscope in them that aids people going upstairs. Those used to be classified as class 3. In the past 5 years or so, it's changed. So FDA is always responding, and as we become more comfortable with the technology, there's less risk involved. And so FDA does respond to that, to that type of new information that comes out. If you do all this research and you really have no idea how your product's regulated, there's a few different mechanisms that you can figure out what classification your product would fall into. If you don't see something that's identical to what you have, or that's super, super close to what you have with a slight change, you can submit essentially questions to the FDA. There's a couple different mechanisms to do it. Some cost money, some don't. They're all non-binding, and it's based upon the information that you share with them at the time that will help you understand how your product is classified. If before you do that, however, I would really encourage you to engage with somebody who understands the medical device space and how the product is regulated, because they're going to have more insight for how things are classified. So you engage with some consultant, there's plenty of them around, to help you identify how your product is classified, because that's going to drive, as we saw, the tests that need to be done, the different levels of documentation that need to be created. So once we've developed the classification, and of course there's development work going on in the background that's continuously working on improving this product, you have to work on billing that application to the FDA, unless you have a class 1 product, but all of the application that goes into submitting to the FDA to prove that your product is either, if it's a class 2 device, substantially equivalent to something that's on the market, or it is, you can prove various claims about your product if it's a class 3 product or a drug or biologic. So the things that need to be involved is, so for testing, there's clearly in the drug and biologic space, preclinical testing, which is animal testing and bench testing, clinical studies, obviously in humans. If you're making an over-the-counter product and you're able to test it to the monograph, you don't have to do anything. So if you have the capability to make new ibuprofen and you can test it to the monograph that exists, then there you go. You don't have to submit anything to the FDA. Of course, they're probably going to show up at your doorstep and want to inspect the facility with which you're making it. When you're making drugs into biologics, there's a variety of different applications that go into effect. So just to get your product into humans at all, you have to submit an investigational new drug application. It's called an IND to FDA. That you're proving that you've done all the testing that you can before it goes into humans, and that it's as safe as you believe that it can be before it goes in. A new drug application is your final application to the FDA to get your product on the market. Similarly, if you're making some sort of generic prescription product, you have a smaller, you have less things that you have to prove than if it was totally brand new. And then there's also the equivalent of a new drug application in the biologic space as a BLA, Biologics Licensing Act. To think about size that we're dealing with, my first role, I worked for DuPont Pharma, and we made one of the big AIDS drugs that came out. And when we submitted that NDA to the FDA, it was 3 U-Haul, full-size U-Haul trucks filled with binders that went to the FDA. So that's the quantity of, and that was stocked full. I have photos of it somewhere, of just how much is involved. Now it's all digital nowadays, but 25 years ago, it wasn't. And that's the sheer amount of data that is submitted that is then ultimately reviewed by the agency. In a medical device space, as you're developing your application, you're required to have various parts of your quality system in place, the design control and how you produce the products, but then there's testing. So I showed you for the wheelchair, here's the list of 40 or 50 different tests that you need to prove compliance with to get your wheelchair onto the market. So the plans that you need to have, and those will mostly probably be some level of bench testing. In some situations, preclinical or animal testing is required. This is often when we're talking about biocompatibility, if it's something that's implanted or rests on the skin for an extended period of time. And then in some situations, almost always for class 3 high-risk devices, but then also for many class 2 products, you have to have some level of clinical testing. I know today we're focused on the FDA and the US market, but the European market, a new set of regulations just went into effect this past spring. It really increases the amount of clinical data that must be provided for any medical device that goes onto the market. That could be clinical data from actual clinical trials, but it could also be from reviewing the published literature that's out there, and a variety of things in between. But the expectation from the Europeans is that you know exactly how your product works in humans and that you're doing additional testings on it. So in the medical device world, for most class 2 products, you may have heard what's called a 510K that goes to the agency, or if it's a class 3 product, it's a pre-market approval. 510Ks to get your application onto the market. To get your product onto the market, a 510K, you have to prove that it is substantially equivalent to something else that's already on the market, where you'll hear the word predicate. And all you have to do is say, yep, my wheelchair is just a whole lot like that other wheelchair that's down the road, and I'll prove it to you, and here's why. And they say, yep, that looks substantially equivalent, and you've done the test that I think you need to do. Here you go, you put it on the market. They're not approving anything. They're not verifying any claims that you have. They are not really looking into any clinical testing that you've done. You just say, yep, it's just like something that's already on the market. So they talk about that, your product's cleared to go onto the market. For the high risk stuff, the FDA does expect you to have done full clinical testing and clinical evaluation. And at that point, they prove the safety and effectiveness of your product that goes onto the market. So in a class 2 product, you don't have to prove safety and efficacy. With a class 3 product, you do have to prove that your product is safe and effective. It does seem kind of strange that 43% of the medical products that are on the market have no claims about safety or efficacy that is required by FDA to get them on the market, but that's the reality. So we talk about clinical trials. You hear in the news a lot about phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. So your phase 1, all you're really looking at is safety. How well does the human body tolerate that drug in use? They're typically short, 6 months to a year. These are normal durations. Obviously, when you're in a pandemic and emergency, things go a bit quicker, but this is that information. So they're usually 20 to 80 people. They're under 100 people. Once that's done, you've proven the product is safe. You typically go into a phase 2 trial. All of these trials, the design of the trial and the enrollment, all of those pieces are actually reviewed by FDA before you're allowed to start enrolling individuals and dosing them. So phase 2 typically lasts about 2 years. Again, it depends upon what it is that you're looking at. It's between 1 and 300 people, and you're really looking at, is it effective for what it's supposed to do? So phase 1 is it safe? Is it going to harm somebody? Is it going to kill them? Phase 2 is, does it work? If you're trying to treat cancer, it's in a phase 2 that we're going to know whether or not that it does do what it needed to do for the cancer, or kill the cancer cells, shrink the tumor, whatever it might be. They're also looking at dosages. So, hey, do we need 100 milligrams of this or 5 milligrams? They're able to look in humans and figure out what is the most, what works the best. Then, if you pass that, most things, frankly, fail at phase 2 with drugs. But if you get past that, you go into a phase 3 trial. So they're anywhere from 200 to 3,000 patients, although for some things you are seeing more in the 5 to 10,000 patients. It really depends upon what the product is. They're looking at that overall risk benefit of the product. So we know it works, but right, so it lowers your blood pressure, but it also causes all your hair to fall out. Well, maybe that's a risk benefit that they're not willing to take. So they're really looking at that. But maybe it only happens in 0.1% of the population. All right, maybe they're able to look at that data and know. Because before, if you look at the phase 2, 300 people, if it's 0.1%, you're not going to see that really show up, but you are the larger populations that you have. So we switch over to medical device design and how that product goes in. A very common model, and this is used by almost everybody, it's the V model. This, if you are making a medical device and you think you've already got a prototype and you're ready to go to market and you haven't thought through these phases that I'm going to talk about, please stop what you're doing and start thinking through some of these things, because you're never going to get your product actually to the market and through the agency unless you've thought through all these pieces. So it always starts with an idea. All right, I want to make a new product. And so you talk to your marketing folks, or you talk to the customers, potential customers, and they say, oh, I want this product and I want to sell it in Brazil. And it needs to be a coffee pot. And it can't be too heavy, but I really want it to be red. All right, these are all very common things that come out. Well, when you go and talk to engineers, and I live with one, so I really understand this, they're going to say, well, what the heck does red mean? There's like 5 million colors of red. What is too heavy? Is it too heavy to a weightlifter? Is it too heavy to your 3-year-old? What does that mean? So at that point, that information gets refined down to what we call design outputs. All right, so if you want to go into Brazil, you got to have everything in Portuguese. And there's a certain plug type, it's called N, that you have to have. Somebody says too heavy. All right, 4 pounds is the max that it can weigh. All right. And for red, they're very specific that it needs to be this Pantone color. As you can imagine, for any product, there's going to be hundreds of these types of things that are involved, trying to make it simple for a coffee maker. During all of this time, the design team is working to develop this prototype. And they go back and forth between the people in marketing or their potential customers out there. Did I get it right? Did I get it right? No, yes, no, okay. So at some point, the design is done. At that point, you cannot do any changes to that product, because effectively you're going to have to start all back over. Once you've completed your product, you have what we call design verification, where you go back to the things that you said that it had to be. So it needs to be less than 4 pounds. We can confirm that's easily verifiable. It has to be plug type N. All right, the plug works like this and it looks that way. Everything needs to be in Portuguese. It's a certain color. All of it needs to be verified. All along the way, all of this information is being documented. At that point, engineering says, yep, you told me it should be this. And I confirm that it is that. At that point, we go back to marketing to the customers. We do what we call design validation. So we say, hey, we heard you. Is this what you wanted? And they come back and say, yep, that's what I want. That's what I meant. Or no, that's not what I didn't. If at any point you have to make design changes that go here, effectively, you're starting back over. You're updating your design outputs to add more information. Maybe we get back to this design validation piece and they say, whoa, 4 pounds, way too heavy. I'm using this for people who can't lift more than 1 pound. So at that point, you've got to go back to your drawing board and start back over. It's only once all of these things are done, these are specifically required by the agency, and you have documentation to support all of this, that you're able to submit and put your product onto the market. So I used a coffee pot as an example here, but this is the exact same process that you apply to any medical device. So to get your product on the market in a medical device space, there's a whole lot of different submissions that go to the agency. There's everything from a pre-submission request, which is, I don't know what I'm doing. It's really unclear what the regulations say for my specific product. I want to go ask them. To various testing, animal studies, applications to investigate your device within humans. So it's an investigational device exemption. Human studies, and then your submission. So when we talked about, it was multiple truckloads of documentation for the drugs and biologic. For a 510K, a class 2, it might be a couple binders worth, 2 3-inch bind, 2 3-inch binders or so, maybe 3 3-inch binders, it depends. Then a class 3, we're talking about having to submit so much more information, including all of your clinical data. That's probably like half or 1 truckload worth of data that's being submitted. Again, it's all electronic now, but I'm trying to give you an idea of scale of the amount of documentation that proves to the agency that you know what you're doing, and that the product, acts as it intends to.
Brie, can you quickly, just to get in a little more detail, who is doing this document? Who should be doing this document?
Oh, great question.
Is it the inventor? Is it?
Yeah, so typically, so the documentation that you're submitting to the FDA, you want somebody who's done it before. So you want to engage with a consultant who has done this regularly, who's going to go back to the inventor, the engineer, whomever, and say, I need these documents. And they'll help you with examples of what they should look like and the level of detail that needs to be involved. So and they're probably going to take that information and write it up themselves, because that consultant knows how to write it in a way that the FDA is going to, the way the FDA is going to want that information. That answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, it's very rare that an inventor on their own does all of this without any input from anyone. That just doesn't happen. I mean, I suppose it could, I don't see it happen. So we talked about the 510Ks, which are mostly for class 2 products. They're substantially equivalent. To submit a 510K as of fiscal year 2022, so that started October 1, earlier this month, it's around $13,000. If you're a small business, it's around $3,000, and that's a certification process to the agency. It'll take about 6 months to review, because there's always some back and forth once they've accepted it for review, meaning it's got all the information that it needs. A PMA, so that's for class 3 products, it's $375,000. If you're a small business, you're certified as such, it's $93,000, $94,000, and it takes a year or two. The reason that it's different, again, is the sheer amount of documentation that is submitted to the agency, and it has to be reviewed by them. If you really you don't know how the product's supposed to be classed, and you've been working with them and they haven't come back to you and just haven't gotten to a solution, there's a process called the de novo. It takes about 5 to 6 months and costs $112,000 or $28,000 if you're a small business. And it takes them about 5 to 6 months. And all they're going to come back to you with is, it's either class 2 or class 3. Do you have a 510K or do you have a PMA? Typically, those early conversations that you're having with the agency will help you determine this before you even go to that de novo. But some things are so innovative and they have nothing that's like it that's on the market that you do have to go this path. So in the quality system, the big difference between the drug quality system and the medical device quality system is that the medical device quality system looks at the entire life cycle from ideation and design all the way through to product being on the market. In the drug quality system, for the most part, there are other controls before this, but really all that it's talking about is the manufacturing and distribution of the product in the drug side of things. Yes, there are regulations around how clinical practices occur, but for the actual drug product, it really doesn't start until very late. Once your product's on the market, there are a variety of things that you have to continue to do once that product's on the market and for a period of time, even if you've pulled that product off of the market. So it's the same for drugs and devices with adverse event reporting, complaint handling, so taking information from the field, any recalls or field actions that might need to occur, supplier monitoring and oversight, as well as advertising and marketing. However, in the drug space, every year you have to submit an annual report that states sort of how your product has performed in the market and what's the clinical information that is available. Oftentimes, as part of the approval, the FDA will have said, you need to do additional studies. Maybe it's to look at pediatrics. That's common because usually we aren't looking at testing products in kids. So there'll be pediatrics, or maybe it's looking at some subpopulation of humans. And then in the medical device space, field actions, and often this comes into effect a lot more now having to do with cybersecurity. So it's an issue where your product is not as secure as it once was. So you have to do some sort of action in the field, i.e. a field action, to upgrade that software to address that security risk. Obviously, product improvement, oversight of suppliers. Additionally, you have to list your product and register with the FDA every year, as long as it's on the market. So I know this is a very high level, but I know that there's a lot of questions. So I'm going to actually go back on my video. I imagine there's some questions. Go back to the video, and if there's certain things about a certain product that you're dealing with, we can happily talk about that in generalities. Oops.
I just want to remind everyone, feel free to either put your question in the chat or come off video, turn on your video, turn on mic, and ask questions yourself. There is one in the chat. How do consultant firms charge hourly by project? How easy is it to start the process for classification?
Yeah, I'm sorry, what was the first bit that you said? So
How
much do they charge?
Charge.
Yeah, so typically for a regulatory and quality consultant, I'm going to say you're roughly in that between $100 and $200 an hour. They're almost always by an hour, but you can often engage in firms that will do a regulatory assessment. So they'll say, hey, you have this idea, and once you kind of flesh something out in your mind, that they will come through and say, if you want to get your product on the market, here's what you need to do. Here's the likely pathway to market. Here's your probable predicates, or here's how it's classified. And they'll often do that at a flat rate. That's usually in the $3,000 to $5,000. But I think it's incredibly useful. People often ask, when I was consulting, or they ask my peers who do this now, because they can use that to go get SBIR grants. They can use that information to go get other investors because it says you've thought through the process.
While we're on the topic of consultants, really should folks be engaging with consultants?
That's a great point. I personally, and I'm a bit biased, you want to start incredibly early. So kind of when you're first having an idea, start partnering with somebody. I know that Oak Tree has some folks on staff that you can talk with. I believe that's the case. They have some folks you can talk with on staff, but it's worth it to start early and at least have somebody who you can call on when you have questions. I've seen too many times when somebody's invested tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in a product, they believe that they're all ready to go to submit their 510K to the agency, and there's some huge glaring hole, some test they haven't done, something they haven't thought through. Sure, there's the cost of the test, but it's also pushed stuff out by 6 months to a year because they didn't do that biocompatibility testing or whatever it is that needed to be done. So the earlier that you know, and at least you know how much it is or is not going to cost you when you engage with them early. It's a very important step.
Thank you. So early as in or prototype, can you give us like a...
Yeah, so what I would I would engage once you have a prototype and you kind of once you've gotten through proof of concept, like, yep, it's a thing and it bends like it's supposed to, and I roughly know what's involved. That's when I would engage somebody. But it doesn't hurt to start interviewing and getting to know people before that. Right now, finding a consultant can be really challenging because they're very busy. There's not a whole lot of them out there. And I'm also finding that they're charging a lot more than they used to just because supply and demand. So getting engaged with somebody sooner. And the way that you find somebody is frankly asking somebody, a peer. So if you're in some sort of mentoring group maybe, or networking, I know like through the Oregon Bioscience Association, I think I saw that Julie was on here. You'll find other people who have been where you were in the past and may have ideas to connect you with.
Um, I had another consultant. Oh, what is the important thing you would say to look for? Obviously, having some feedback on who's credible, but what other things should you look for when you're looking for a consultant?
What you really want to look for is somebody who has expertise in the type of product that you have. So for example, if somebody's only ever worked with biologics, you don't want to engage them for a medical device. Or they've only ever worked on very simple class 1 products, you're probably not going to want to engage them for your new handheld ultrasound machine or whatever it is. One way, especially if you have a fairly unique product, is you can look up the actual 510K applications that were submitted to the agency, and you can see who submitted it. And often it's not actually a large company. If it's a small company, they've worked with a consultant, and it will say, Joe Smith, consultant to Acme Company. And I would call that person because they probably know a lot about that product. I've done this before because nobody can be really good at everything. There's so many nuances in each and every product.
We have a specific question about in vitro diagnostics and whether there's a specific classification or if they just fall within devices generally.
Yeah, so in vitro diagnostics are considered medical devices, and they are all classified class 1, 2, or 3, just like medical devices are. I've been really into following the whole Theranos issue and listening to all the podcasts for the trial that's going on right now. And that's an area where they sort of got into trouble, and they tried to claim that they were just a clinical lab the whole time and weren't actually a device. And there were some issues that fell into that space, but they're just like I showed you the regulation for the wheelchair in the example, you'll see similar regulations that specifically call out for those types of devices, tests that are out there.
Jack, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thanks. That was really nice. A couple things. I'm in dentistry. We have a situation now with people being able to buy so many things over the internet that can come from all over the place. Sometimes you'll see a product. Now, well, for example, talk about a dental light curing unit for curing composites in your mouth, and they'll show an FDA insignia on it, and often a CE one as well. Yep. And make it you assume that it's been FDA approved. We know it's not approved.
Yeah.
But it's difficult because these things are being sold and people are buying them directly, not going through, let's say, a supplier. Do you see this in a lot of other devices, medical devices too?
So that's illegal. So that's the other thing is, if you ever see FDA, so if like on your Amazon or whatever, and it says like FDA approved or FDA cleared, you cannot, if you are actually FDA approved by FDA, you can say that you are approved by the FDA. But all class 2 and all class 1 products, so we're talking about 90% of all the products, it's illegal to state that FDA has done anything there. So you cannot say that you are FDA cleared. You can't do anything, because all that that's really saying is that you're following like the lowest of all lowest level of expectations. But I know that there's been a lot of issues. I have a friend who works for a company in the region, and they make like bandage type products, sort of high-end bandage products. And some of their products through a distributor were sold on Amazon, and they had to do a recall, and they were trying to get that product through Amazon off the market, and they can't do it. There's actually lawsuits going on right now from the Department of Justice against Amazon for saying, look, you're not controlling your suppliers well enough for this exact example that you're talking about. So it's still a bit of the Wild West. I got to be honest, when I'm feeling a little bit vindictive, I'll just go onto Amazon and find where they said like they're FDA approved and just report them, because I don't know, it just feels good. It's rare, but it is kind of fun to do. Oh, to that point, Jack, the one thing that you can do is you can actually submit, there's a website that you can submit to FDA about what that is. Some people will do it on their own, or they'll engage with a consultant just to write a letter to point out, because maybe they don't want to point out their competitor who's making some false claim, but you can submit to the FDA sort of a letter that says that. Whether it does a whole lot of good, that's, to be determined.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
I apologize for the background, but the device I'm trying to develop is classified as 510K pre-market notification exempt. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and what that means.
Yeah, so it's 510K exempt, you said?
Yes.
Okay, so I just want to make sure that I heard you. So as I said, most class 2 products require a 510K. That's some that does not. And so you still have to follow all the testing requirements and stuff that it's involved. But what it means is that before you put it on the market, it does not require the FDA to review your 510K before you put it on. You can just go and put it on the market. You still have to follow the registration and register it. And that does, as soon as you register your product and register your company, you then are open to FDA coming to visit you to look at how the product's manufactured.
Other questions from the group? While we're waiting, I'm going to put 2 links in the chat. One is just to give some feedback on the seminar, and the other is our OHSU's innovation newsletter if you want to hear more about events like this across OHSU and hear about fun innovation related things that OHSU is involved with.
And just, I'm not consulting anymore, but if you have questions, feel free to send them to Melissa, and I can at least maybe connect you with somebody who can help you, or at least, provide some resources that may be helpful on the side. And Oak Tree has a lot of resources, and other folks within OHSU and other organizations are available. But I can at least, it's all about who you know, so I'm happy to connect people.
I imagine that there are probably some folks in this room who have an idea, maybe a prototype that they're working on, have started collecting some data and looking at this regulatory process, and they're going, "Oh my gosh, I don't know if I can make it this." Maybe licensing is a cup of tea. Can you talk a little bit about the regulatory process for a new technology in terms of a company trying to license? Like, are there certain things that acquiring companies are looking for in terms of regulatory compliance beforehand?
Oh, sure. So any reputable company, before they're going to license your technology, is going to want to know that you've done the appropriate due diligence, that you have a quality system in place, that you, in your design and development work, you have well documented. Because the better documentation you have, the more they're going to pay, to be completely honest, because it means it's less things that they have to do. However, a lot of people right now are doing totally virtual companies. So they have an idea, but then they outsource the design, they outsource the manufacturing, they outsource whatever. And what's really critical there, and this is not uncommon, but what's really critical in doing that is having incredibly clear supplier agreements that says who does what. And it's not just who supplies the raw materials for somebody to make the component, it's who submits what information to the FDA, who's responsible for completing internal audits, who's being very detailed. So that when it comes back and something goes awry, you have the documentation that says, no, truly, you were supposed to do that. I wasn't supposed to do that. But as the owner and whoever puts that product onto the market, they're ultimately responsible for everything that's with that product.
Wonderful. Well, it looks like we are at time. So without further ado, I'll let everyone get back to their day. But thank you, Brie, and thank you everyone for joining us. I hope this was very insightful. I know it was for me. We'll have a recording of this that I'll share with everyone who attended. And if Brie doesn't mind, we can share the slides as well.
Yeah, that shouldn't be a problem. I can get them to you.
Perfect. And again, if anyone has any further regulatory questions, please feel free to send them to me and I can connect you with Brie.
Have a wonderful day, everyone. And good luck with your new products.
Thank you.
Bye.